And I would like to welcome Chuck to welcome us to the meeting and tell us about the objective of this meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this event for some time and to welcome all of you to it. And I'm glad that we all appear to be well and we're able to get together like this. And I hope we'll have a couple more meetings to sort of build a cohort among people working on healthy urban environments. And in fact, it's a cohort of people committed to improving the reaction to extreme heat and air quality problems in our region. The goal today is several fold, and the primary goal is to sort of have progress reports on the projects that started last year in 2019 to get a sense of what's been done and what can be done and what are our goals. Hopefully some new ideas have emerged since these projects began, and they're the kind of thing we can discuss as a group and advance our combined ideas on how to address these problems. Most of all, I hope the reports and the discussion following will emphasize how each of these projects are moving toward real world solutions that improve people's lives and can be implemented in our region. Toward that end, there's a number of pieces. One is what more needs to be done. I mean, we have 6 projects from the first year and depending on how you count it, 7 or 8 projects from this current year. But these are not meant to be just 15 projects on their own separate. Our intention is that we address these overall problems and in some ultimate way integrate the projects together. Toward that end, I hope today takes us on the first step of what more needs to be done that isn't already being done. I think today we're living in a different world than when the Healthy Urban Environment Project began, and I'd like people to contemplate how the work they're doing relates to 3 major sea level changes that we're experiencing. The first, obviously, is the pandemic from COVID-19. It has changed many of our research strategies. It's changed people's behavior. It, in fact, may have put many more people at risk. This could be a very, very serious health-wise summer that we're looking forward to. The second is, and it's related to the COVID pandemic, is we have a real economic upheaval that we're experiencing. The very fact we're all in our own homes or wherever we are doing this meeting instead of in room 481 in Wrigley Hall means that things are different. And how does that affect our project and how does that affect people's response to heat and air quality problems? And the third, of course, is the issue of social justice. Many of our projects are already formulated on the idea that people who lack resources have disproportionate burdens from heat and air quality. And we'd like to think, how can we address that? How can we move this kind of environmental injustice or environmental racism from the scene and move forward in different ways? So that's sort of where I hope we are in the next hour and a half. We've scheduled for July 29th a follow-up meeting that'll focus on the 2020 projects and whatever progress they've made by that time. And I'd like to believe these 2 meetings and perhaps an August meeting, if we see beneficial, will define where we're going to go for the remainder of the HUE project. What are the priorities? What are the gaps? What are the needs? And what are the opportunities that we can pursue, hopefully as a more integrated group going forward? So let me turn this over to Rachel Braun, who's a new member of our team, to start the presentations. Thank you for coming.
Hi, so good morning, everyone. So I'm Rachel Braun, and I just joined the HUE team as a postdoc at the beginning of June. I graduated from the University of Arizona this past May with my degree in chemical engineering and a minor in atmospheric science. A lot of my graduate work focused on aerosols and clouds, mostly in marine environments, but I had a little bit of experience working in an urban environment in Manila in the Philippines. But I'm really, really excited to hear about your projects today and learn as much as I can and start working on projects here in Maricopa County. So to begin, we're going to start off with the presentation about the right shade in the right place.
And Ariane, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, let me see if that works. Share. Okay, looks like it's working. Okay, well, thank you all for being here today and having me over in my own home office. I would like to present to you the current status of the Right Shade in the Right Place project that's being funded by HUE. And I have a lot of slides, so I'm trying to not rush, but still get through all of them. I probably don't have to introduce the problem. It's very hot in the desert Southwest. Shade is really important to improve outdoor thermal comfort for people who are out and about in the sun. The issue with this is that although many cities here in the valley, in the whole metro region, or in all of Maricopa County have tree canopy goals outlined in urban forestry plans. One of them is the city of Tempe, the city of Phoenix, ask for a canopy cover of about 25% in the future. There are a lot of issues with implementing these plans because there are a lot of locations where you would love to plant trees, but you just cannot plant them due to infrastructure challenges such as sewer lines, power lines that are in the way, maybe you block signage, and there's no actionable information for the cities to actually make better decisions on shade alternatives that might work instead of trees. So we, in this project, asked the question, what's the most effective shade type depending on the urban context that you're in and also the function of the space? We separated the shade types that we'll be investigating into trees, engineered lightweight structures that could be umbrellas, shade sails, anything that you could temporarily put up, and then urban form that would include shade from buildings, overhangs, awnings, street canyons that provide shade. And the overall goal of this project is to assess the performance of all of these shade types and then develop guidelines and best practices for the city. Initially, the city of Tempe, we're working with Braden Kay on this, but then moving forward to being able to expand this to other cities in the region. We used MARDI for this study, and to give you a little bit of background on heat and thermal exposure, it's actually not air temperature that's the most important variable, or that for shade consideration, because air temperature does not include the radiation. So there's a concept called mean radiant temperature. It's a temperature value that summarizes the long and short wave radiation that hits your body as you're standing outside in the sun or in the shade. And mean radiant temperature can be up to 30 degrees Celsius higher in the sun because of the shortwave radiation that hits your body than if you're in the shade. So MARDI can measure all of this. Here's a picture of MARDI at the Phoenix Zoo parking lot from last week. MARDI is wearing a face mask too. And MARDI has net radiometers. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but these are the round shaped sensors that look a little bit like Wall-E, and they measure the short and long wave radiation that hits the body. So we used MARDI to take measurements of any shade type that you can think of. And we did this in what's called transect observations. So we picked several locations. We went from location to location, set up MARDI, let MARDI measure conditions in those locations for about a minute so that the sensors can adjust, and then MARDI was moved to the next location. We started this project actually in 2016 and looked at locations on ASU's Tempe campus, and then with the HUE funding, we expanded this beyond the Tempe campus to also look at the Mill Avenue district, which is a little bit more urban, has a little bit taller buildings, and then we also included trees and other shade structures in the Kiwanis Park last summer. So we did these
My video keeps freezing. I don't know if everybody else is on.
Was that a question?
Sorry, Melissa, the video is going forward, so it might just be on your end.
Oh, okay, sorry. Well, I'll just continue. So we conducted these transects starting early in the morning after sunrise, and then continued till after sunset, 9 o'clock. Again, we stopped at each location for 45 seconds or a minute so that the sensors can adjust, measured, and then we moved on. And we also took some fisheye photos to determine the amount of visible sky at each location. after we collected all the data, we specifically looked at 4 heat metrics. We looked at the difference in air temperature between a shaded location and sun-exposed location, the difference in mean radiant temperature, the difference in incoming solar radiation, and the difference in surface temperature. And the reason why we look at differences is because the conditions during each measurement day might be slightly different. So one day it might be 42 degrees Celsius, another day it might be 40 degrees Celsius. To kind of eliminate this variation, we look at the difference between shade and sun, and this is our performance metric. And then we looked at different times of days. We looked at the overall performance throughout the whole day. We looked at the peak incoming solar radiation time of day, which would be around noon. We looked at the peak air temperature time, which would be more in the late afternoon, 4 o'clock-ish. And then we also looked at the daytime heat mitigation benefit versus the nighttime heat retention trade-off. And I'm not going to have time to talk about all of this. So here's a picture, and this is very busy, just to show you that these are all the locations we looked at in the Tempe area and the Kiwanis Park. We had 159 locations total, and we ended up with 1,988 observations. Here are some visuals of the different shade structures we looked at. We looked at umbrellas, shade sails, urban canyons, different types of trees, palm trees, and so on. And let me move to the results because I think I only have 2.5 minutes left. So these are the results for air temperature. And this is the air temperature for each hour of the day that we measured. And it's the difference between the sun exposed and shaded locations. And I would just like to point out in this figure, if you look at the average air temperature, that's the line in this box plots in the center of each of the boxes, the average air temperature difference between shade and sun was a maximum of 0.6 degrees Celsius. So air temperature is really not the variable we would like to track or look at for this study. So here, on the other hand, is the difference in mean radiant temperature. Again, x-axis is each hour of the day that we looked at. Y-axis is the delta, or the difference in mean radiant temperature between the exposed sites, which are the yellow boxes, and then each of the different shade groups that we looked at. The natural shade, the trees, the engineered shade, which would be the shade sails and umbrellas, and then the urban form, which is the awnings and buildings.
We have 1 minute left.
Okay, and you can clearly see that the magnitude of the difference in mean radiant temperature is throughout the day between 20 to up to 30 degrees Celsius, and the urban form actually performed much better or best out of all these shade types. Here's a figure that shows you a breakdown. Again, this is overall performance for the whole day between all the different shade types we looked at, from shade sails to umbrellas, down to breezeways and tunnels. And in the interest of time, I unfortunately have to skip over this, but we can go back to this during the discussion. And then here is another figure that shows you a ranking, so to speak, of all the different tree species that we investigated. And overall, you can see the urban form performs best, and the trees and the engineered shade are trailing, but not by much. So let me come to the conclusions. This is the last slide. We don't want to discriminate against any type of shade. So all shade is great. So this study was not meant to prefer some shade types over others. We just wanted to show the variation and see which shade type might perform best in which situation. So overall, we found that the shade from urban form, or from solid structures, was most effective in reducing mean radiant temperature, surface temperature, and radiation. And that was followed by the trees and those lightweight structures such as umbrellas and shade sails. If you look at the structural shade, it was performing differently if it was east, west, or north, south oriented, obviously. And then the trees varied widely in performance. And one of the limitations of this study is that as we looked at our samples, we really prioritized the shade variety over the repetition. So some of the tree types have really low sample sizes, and that's future work to increase those sample sizes. With this, I would like to thank my team. So these are all the team members. We have Saud Al-Khaled from Kuwait University, Bjorn Hagen from SOS, Paul Coseo, who's on the call as well, and then Florian Schneider, my PhD student. Okay, I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much for the update. I think the format we're going to go with is going through each of the presentations. So I think we'll move on to the next one, which is developing and testing heat-ready standards for cities.
Okay, let me stop sharing.
And hi, everyone. Good morning. This is Dave Hondula, and I am navigating to the Zoom controls here. But thanks, Ari, for that great presentation, and hope everyone is doing well. Bear with me for just a moment, finding the Zoom controls. To start, as the screen is coming online here, it is clear, as we heard even just yesterday in a webinar organized by the Global Heat Health Information Network, that governance for urban heat is an emergent challenge, and cities are really in the early stages of a comprehensive approach to take on this problem. And what I'll be talking about is one of our efforts to fill in some of those gaps in governance. I'm sorry, I know we're not screen sharing yet. Trying to get there. Thank you for bearing with me. As we're getting this going, I'd also like to acknowledge Liza Kurtz, who's a graduate student who has been really leading a lot of the work on this project. Some of you have been contributing as well, thank you. And in particular, I wanted to acknowledge Mark Hartman and Braden Kay from the cities of Phoenix and Tempe. They've been really helping us ground our thinking about this project in their experiences in their own cities. Okay, we are getting there. How is the screen sharing, Adora? Are we operating?
Looks good.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry for the delay. Things are getting and so on. So here's a quote that Melissa Guardaro will recognize because it's her words. This was in a report to Scientific American that Scientific American published last year. Just speaking to the fact that there's a lot of attention on heat, but it's not clear how formalized our responsibility structures are for managing this hazard that we all recognize as being so important. And the need for improved management of heat really came to a point with the city of Phoenix a few years ago when they were successful in applying to the Bloomberg Philanthropies Mayor's Challenge. And this really catalyzed a lot of activity in the city of Phoenix to think about how heat was being managed. And one of the most memorable parts of that process for me was this meeting that you can see here, where Karen Peters, the deputy city manager, had assembled representatives who might participate in a heat task force representing departments all across the city. And a major surprise to us in the early part of this meeting was that nearly every person in this room had never worked together in this capacity, just speaking to the lack of existing coordination structures and collaboration around this topic that we know is so important. So we've been thinking hard about what we can do to fill in that collaboration and governance gap. And we're seeing progress already and evolution. This is the most recent version of the City of Phoenix's organizational chart that's available online. And if you squint at the bottom of the slide on the right-hand side, you'll see that HeatReady is included as an initiative. To the best of our knowledge, this may be the first time that heat has ever appeared on an organizational chart for a municipal government in the United States. But even still, as you scan this organizational chart, you can recognize that there are a lot of different departments that might have a role to play in managing urban heat. And the question is, how can we coordinate across all of these programs to be working toward shared goals and objectives? And that's where the idea for the HeatReady program came in. HeatReady was inspired by a program that the National Weather Service runs called StormReady, which has certified more than 3,000 communities across the United States that have demonstrated a certain level of preparedness for extreme weather events. This photo here, you might recognize some of the faces. Pinal County was recently added to the list of storm-ready communities. And we've had a close look at the storm-ready application, recognize that there are some gaps or some areas of storm preparedness that aren't as relevant to taking on heat. So our work over the past year plus has looked a lot like this, where we've been having many conversations, some with you, the academic experts, many conversations with folks in city government, some from national and international offices that deal with heat, to test out different concepts for what a HeatReady evaluation program might look like. City staff have been interacting with various prototypes of this system. We've been continuing to iterate and improve it moving forward to create an application process that is now ready to roll. Through these conversations, and just yesterday I tabulated that I believe we've had more than 50 different people provide input to this process over the past few years, again, representing many sectors. We've heard that there are three major contributions that this HeatReady program could provide. One is an evaluation tool. That's what I'll talk about today. We've also heard a need and desire for a resource repository and a community of support. And the resource repository might include examples of how to run certain heat-related programs. The community of support would provide dialogue and perhaps events as well, all working toward the mission of enabling local governments to holistically manage how they identify, prepare for, mitigate, track, and respond to the dangers of urban heat. Let's talk very briefly about the HeatReady standards for cities. This is the evaluation tool. This has been, again, iterating and evolving over the past many months. And we have solidified now on 4 major parts to what we're calling the Tier 1 application. Tier 1 application is the foundational level. Tier 1 cities are those that will have demonstrated the necessary foundation to begin addressing heat and its impacts in a comprehensive manner. And figuring out where the bar is for this introductory level tier has been a really interesting part of the conversation with city staff and others. We've identified 4 areas of competency, if you will. 1 is called climate assessment, 2, impact awareness, 3, management and networks, 4, and category 4 called action inventory. And you can see each of these areas of competency is focused on a particular question that we've been crafting over the past many months. And I really wanted to shout out the contribution of Ray Quay. Previous iterations of the tool looked more like a checklist. And Ray really guided us to think about questions that we'd be asking cities to answer, and we're really happy with where we've landed there. So cities will be asked to answer these questions through an application. And the application has a few different components. There's, of course, basic information about the city, 4 short narratives of approximately 500 words. There are 4 data tables that cities will complete. Cities are welcome to upload additional documents. For example, both Mark and Braden have tons of resources that they might add to include in their application process. And then we've added some questions at the end of the application, evaluating the application itself. Remember, we're still in a pilot stage, still in the early stage of understanding this tool, how will it work. So we asked some questions like, how many people did it take to complete the application? How long did it take to complete the application? Which questions would you be most interested to read answers from other cities, and so forth? The application, thank you, Dora, perfect. The application is operationalized in Qualtrics right now, and is ready to, it is live. Here's just a sample of what it looks like. There's, of course, some guidance text. There are links to all sorts of resources that cities might use to complete the applications. For example, if a city doesn't have any resources at their fingertips in terms of a climate assessment, there are 7 or 8 different links where they can go and other recommendations to have access to climate data. The idea here for Tier 1 is not to create a ton of additional work, but just to get some initial thoughts on paper and get them organized. And where there are gaps, of course, compel cities to try to fill those in the early stages. There are these data tables I mentioned as well, a few different sections. Our plan is to have a handful of cities completed here. I'll show the timeline on the next slide. We're anticipating or have committed participation from Phoenix and Tempe. Thank you, Mark and Braden. Mark and Braden have gone through several iterations previously, helping us vet the questions, understand what could work, and we're so thankful that they've helped us get to this stage. Yuma will provide a very different context for us, as will Las Cruces, New Mexico. And we've had early interest from Scottsdale and Tucson, although I'm not sure it will that they will participate in this phase just yet. Our timeline is that cities are being invited now. Review will be happening over the next month. We'll be announcing results later this summer, and we have some other aspirational goals for the fall. Thank you again to everybody that's been involved, and to Hugh for the support.
Great. Thank you very much for the update. So we'll move into the next presentation, which is dealing with quantifying the air quality benefit of a novel dust suppression technique.
Great. Can you all hear me okay? Thank you very much. So I'm going to change gears and start talking a little bit about our air quality work. And specifically, we're all living in the desert, and so we're all familiar with the impact of dust entrainment from uncovered lands, whether that be construction sites, which might be temporary, or unpaved roads, or agricultural lands, or other things like that. So we had the opportunity with another ASU research center, the Center for Bioinspired and Biomimetic Geotechnics. They're mostly interested in soil stabilization. We've come up with a new approach using an enzyme to induce calcium precipitation. I'll go through the chemistry in just a second. But they're mostly interested in soil stabilization and prevention of erosion. We looked at this as an opportunity to collaborate with them, to quantify the air quality benefits of this approach, and also to leverage some of their corporate engagement. CBBG is an engineering research center, and one of their primary routes of engagement is through corporations. So we have that opportunity for engagement going forward. Sorry, I'm having Zoom problems here. So the background is shown here. This is the chemistry at the top. I'm not going to go through a lot of details of that. What we wanted to do is we wanted to do two field applications. We were going to do a first assessment with initial measurements just of particle mass. We wanted to use the results from that preliminary to redefine and optimize our deployment for our second field program, which is not just going to look at particle mass, it's also going to look at particle chemical composition and see if we can determine anything from that. I apologize, I forgot to acknowledge Jason Meek, who's on the phone. This is a picture of Jason on our first installation. Jason is a graduate student who's been working on this project. Our first deployment was at the Apache Junction landfill. We started in October by deploying 4 of these clarity sensors. These clarity sensors are great because they're very easy to install, but they are laser particle counters, which have some limitations because they basically measure an optical signal, convert that optical signal to a particle mass, which is usually what is regulated. But they also automatically upload the data every 15 minutes. And because there are concerns about how do you convert an optical signal into a particle mass signal, we are much more interested in just comparisons between 2 sites rather than the absolute mass concentrations. So as I said, we went out in October. Our collaborators from CBBG did their enzyme-induced calcium precipitation treatment in December. This is a picture of them spraying the exposed soil, and our PM10 concentrations are shown in this graph here. Our goal would be to calibrate the sensors. We had a full 2 months to look at the intercomparison between the sensors to see how the different sensors relate to each other, because there is some difference in the calibration of these sensors. But then we wanted to evaluate after the treatment, and so that's the data in blue. And we'll keep that color scheme going forward. Orange is pre-treatment, blue is post-treatment. So we had 4 plots. One was a control plot, and we had 3 different treatment plots. I'm only going to show you one of the treatment plots compared to the control plot just for simplicity. One of the things that we quickly discovered, well, I guess we actually knew this, but we didn't appreciate the importance, is the value of wind. And specifically, these extreme dust events are always associated with very strong winds. So what's shown here over on the left-hand side of the screen is the control on the vertical axis. So that is the unmitigated soil versus the controlled soil on the horizontal axis. The gray dots there are pre-spray. The yellow dots are post-spray. The red is a one-to-one line. So the first thing to note is that the one-to-one line most of the data fall off of that 1-to-1 line. So there is some variation between these sensors. Even though the sensors are calibrated before they go out into the field, there is some minor variation. If you look on the right-hand side, this is the treatment versus the control for higher wind speeds, over 10 miles an hour. And you do start to see some difference between pre-control and post-control into that. Now, we've looked at this data in all different ways. We've looked at the impact of PM10 in the control versus the EICP as a function of wind speed. And so again, the idea here would be, first of all, that we would want to have a significant number of data points under high wind conditions. Unfortunately, we didn't have that. Unfortunately, we didn't have the types of high wind events that usually are associated with dust entrainment. We then looked at this normalized difference. And so the normalized difference is shown here both as a function of wind speed. And so on the left is the controlled minus, the treatment minus the controlled, and just the difference there as a function of wind speed. We don't really see any function of wind speed. If you look on the right-hand side, the red line there is the date that the treatment occurred. And what we would have hoped to see is that there would be a significant improvement in the dust mitigation after the treatment. So let me skip ahead to our conclusions. Let me just say that we've learned a lot from our first deployment. First, we suggest very significantly increasing the plot size. The plots were only separated by 20 feet. We do see some blow from one plot to the next plot. We also realized that it's very important to measure wind locally. When we were in Apache Junction, we were using the wind data from the Phoenix Mesa Gateway Airport, also known as the ASU Polytechnic Campus. So we did go out and purchase a wind sensor. So in our next deployment, we are going to be installing the wind sensor. Part of it is also a concern about the time of year. Summertime is associated with more of these convective storms that typically build up a lot of dust. So we're, one of the benefits of the delay due to the pandemic is our sampling was delayed from the spring into the summertime. So maybe that will give us a better opportunity to get more of these very active convective storms and see if it has an impact. And then finally, not only are we doing the clarities in our next deployment, we're also doing particle chemical composition. We're interested in seeing is there a noticeable change in the chemical composition that might be worrisome, because we are adding urea. We're also adding calcium chloride to this to enable the precipitation, which is meant to stabilize the soil. So going forward. So just having said that, we are going to be out in the field tomorrow. Jason and I are going to go out and do our initial deployment at a different landfill. This time we're going to the Salt River landfill, which is right there on Gilbert Road and the Beeline Highway as you head out to Fountain Hills. So we're going out tomorrow morning, installing our samplers again for this pre-calibration. I don't know if we're installing the wind sensor tomorrow, Jason, or not. We might wait until we actually, after the treatment. But with that, I think I'm out of time, so I will stop right there.
I was just about to say, please wrap up.
Great, thank you for the update. So now we'll move into the next presentation, which deals with neighborhood scale comparison of heat mitigation strategies in Phoenix.
All right, thank you. I'm sharing my screen now. Hopefully you can see it. Yep. All right. So thank you. So our project seeks to use a combination of measurements and modeling to inform neighborhood design and heat mitigation strategies. So I'm working on this project with my PhD student, Peter Crank, who couldn't be here today. He might be joining us in the midst of this presentation. And he's actually doing the vast majority of the heavy lifting really on this project. So the project objective is to inform neighborhood design through detailed modeling and measurements, resulting in cooler, healthier, and more equitable environments. And specifically, we're doing this project for a neighborhood in Phoenix. We're using the Edison Eastlake neighborhood as a case study. And the city of Phoenix is redeveloping this neighborhood. It's here in this map. If you look sort of at the where I-10 does the bend, we've got the Edison East Lake neighborhood. And it's going to be a mixed income development with improved active transit, a lot of new vegetation, a lot of tree cover and shade surfaces, new buildings. They're completely raising, the vast majority of the buildings are going to be knocked down and rebuilt. With one of the goals being to provide a more thermally comfortable neighborhood. So our goal is to use this opportunity to see if we can use model to inform the design process in a reliable way. I should mention that this project is actually a rather large collaboration among a number of groups on different aspects of the physical and social sciences. Our HUE project focuses just on modeling the neighborhood, making measurements in the neighborhood, and then asking the question, what will the thermal environment look like if we change the neighborhood? So as a project overview, we're using a microscale atmospheric model to evaluate, first of all, the current thermal conditions in the neighborhood. We have to use observations to validate the model to verify model performance. Once we trust the model, we can then explore redesign plans and look at the impacts that the redesign has on thermal impacts. And so our measurements are wide ranging. We have both fixed weather stations that we've deployed on several rooftops of buildings that are not being demolished. And so these offer a long-term measurement record along with some pole-mounted, so utility pole-mounted weather stations. And then we do episodic measurements both with Marty, which you heard about before. So Ariana is helping us with that and her students. And vehicle traverses using a platform that I've created over the years so that we can get ambient air temperature data throughout the neighborhood. So just to give you a sense of where we are right now, we started the measurements before the HUE project began. So we have a full 2 years of data for the precondition of the neighborhood. And we have data, this is just a diurnal plot that shows June 24, 2018, where you see that the intra-neighborhood temperature variation is not large, but several degrees actually does make a big difference. And so right now we're seeing intra-neighborhood variation on the order of 2 to 3 degrees, with some of the hottest areas being the ones that are the undeveloped dirt areas of the neighborhood. Some of the traverse measurements that we've made, we have just this graphic here that shows you on the map the car traverses we've made through the neighborhood. Much of the neighborhood is off here to the right, and you see the Edison Park at the top. So we do these traverses with the car, but also Marty, which has some replicate measurements where the cars are, but also can go places where cars cannot go. The Enzymatic modeling itself, we're using version 4.44 of Enzymatic to simulate microclimate. We're using a much larger grid than is traditionally used with Enzymatic, which means it's an extremely slow simulation. So we're running the simulation at 2-meter resolution. So we're actually resolving individual buildings and structures throughout the domain. This is approximately the domain here in this map. And we've got 30 vertical levels in the model. So our model evaluation is still ongoing, but the basic process is that we extract Enzymatic model output at locations and times that are coincident with our observations, either from Marty, vehicle traverses, or the pole and roof mounted weather stations. And we quantify error metrics. So this is just a snapshot of Enzymatic. It's actually still running for this particular simulation. We've extracted data up to about noon or 1 p.m. And it should be finishing up the simulation in the next several weeks, we hope. But this shows you the temperature variation across the neighborhood as is for a June 19th, 2019 simulation. The neighborhood is in the process of being redesigned. So Edison Park itself is going to extend a little further south than it currently does. And there's also going to be this linear park off to the west side of the neighborhood. There's also a lot more tree cover, perhaps an increase of factor of 1.5 or 1.75. The 1 to 2 story buildings are being replaced with 2 to 4 story buildings. There are shade structures being deployed. You can see them here in blue. as well as photovoltaic shade on rooftops. And so our goal is to model these changes in the neighborhood and see what that does to the urban environment. So we can look at mean radiant temperature, as Ariana has talked about earlier. We can also look at ambient air temperature. So this is just a cross section at 1.5 meter height across the domain, and you see that most of the modifications in the domain happen off here on the west side. This is the hospital right here. And so those modifications that we talked about, at least at noon in the simulation, create a difference temperature, so a cooling effect at that 1.5 meters that's on the order of 0.5 to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is actually a very substantial cooling. And we hope that we'll be able to validate or verify that cooling performance when the buildings are actually built and our monitoring is ongoing. So our continued work through December 2020, so we have a no-cost extension right now. As I mentioned, the simulations are really slow, and so we will be finishing up the baseline and redesign simulations.
You have 1 minute left.
Perfect. We'll be finalizing the model evaluation. We'll be analyzing the modeled impact of the redesign for cooling, and we'll disseminate the results in the form of a final report for Hugh, but also a journal article that Peter is currently starting to work on, and presentations to the community, city, and at conferences. And so, the upshot of this entire project is that by proving the efficacy of the model, we can then inform future designs for this neighborhood, for other neighborhoods, and actually, with some credibility, provide guidance to city planners as they redevelop neighborhoods. So with that, I'll finish up here, and obviously we don't have questions here, but at the end we'll have additional time for questions.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. So we'll move on to our next one, which is dealing with photocatalysts on solar panels for NOx control.
Okay, can you hear and see? Can you see and hear me? Okay, so we're going to talk about our project, which is more fundamental, and so it's done in collaboration with Matt, and most of the work is done by Jesse, who is also on this call. What is the problem that we try to address? NOx, so nitrogen oxides, NO and NO2, contribute to local air pollution issues in general, and in Phoenix in particular. The NOx are actually one of the main reasons on why the Phoenix brown cloud is brown. And then these NOx, nitrogen oxides, also contribute to summer high pollution events, so our ozone events. So they are, together with sunlight and VOCs, they are the ingredients that make photochemical smog, so summer ozone. Now, the main sources in an urban environment of these NOx, nitrogen oxides are vehicles. And so we propose to contribute to the solution to this, or to contribute to a reduction of nitrogen oxides in urban atmosphere through making bifunctional solar cells, so to have photocatalysis on the surface of solar cells. In urban environments, we have already the benefit sometimes of the solar cells as shade structures, but also many of the parking spots, like the ones here at ASU, are covered with these solar cells. And so the idea is that we coat the top of the solar cells with photocatalysts like titanium oxide that will help reduce NOx. So we know from previous studies that sunlight, UV light mostly, the UV component of the sunlight, will help reduce NOx by, in combination with the photocatalyst, to actually oxidize NO into NO2, and then NO2 into nitric acid or nitrate, The nitric acid that we form is actually extremely sticky, so it will stick to surfaces. It will react with dust or so on the surfaces to get nitrate. And so it is actually removing these nitrogen oxides like this from the atmosphere. Studies showed that this might be relatively efficient, and people even developed paint to do this. And so our study here is, the goal is to have a proof of concept that we can make this work, and that we can make this work on solar cells, because the wavelengths that of the light that interact with the photocatalyst, they're actually in a range where photocells are not very efficient. So we wouldn't take away much of the property of the photovoltaics to generate electricity, while still seeing a reduction in nitrogen oxides in the air. So first part of our project was really to set up and develop a setup in the lab to be able to observe this. So for this, we ended up building a setup that has different measurement instruments that allow us upstream and downstream of the photocatalyst to measure NOx concentrations. We have a solar simulator set up, and we have different sized setups that allow us to actually test, have the sunlight or controlled irradiation of the photocatalyst, and observe any decrease in NO, NO2, or any changes in the atmosphere we expose to photocatalyst and light. Now, a problem that we had over the last 3 months was that we have a very fundamental lab study. And so for the last 3 months, we had a safety closure because of COVID. And so we were a little bit slowed down because of that. So during that time, we really couldn't do any measurements. Still, at this stage, we have preliminary results. So we tested some photocatalysts, we tested some paint photocatalysts and some commercial photocatalysts, and the results were very promising, because what we saw was, even without optimizing setup, without detailed study, because we were stopped, we saw that we actually easily got a 10% reduction in NO concentrations by using the photocatalyst. So the figures here show no light and then light, and here the two photocatalysts we tested, and so we saw a 10% decrease in NO concentrations. Now, unfortunately, not all is great, because what we also started realizing is that we saw an increase in NO2 concentrations. What this tells us is that, well, it works, we oxidize NO into NO2, but we don't really succeed in pushing it to nitric acid or to NO3. What this is problematic is because NO2 is also part of NOx, so it doesn't really solve the issue. However, we have many ideas on how to actually optimize the system, how to work on to make sure that we got complete or at least larger conversion of NO and NO2 into nitric acid and nitrate. And so this is what we are working on right now. What our work now over summer is that we actually now that we have our setup, that we actually can vary many more of the parameters to understand what's going on. Particularly, we can look at contact times. These initial studies were run as a flow-through reactor, or in many cases in an urban environment above the solar cells, we might have a little bit convection, but overall our contact time would be higher, and so we would expect better conversions. We're also going to test different catalysts and different kind of coatings. On the right here, you see the paint coating and some dip coating that we did. And this is, of course, not what we're really aiming for. We're aiming for coatings and or doping the glass surface of the solar cells with different techniques.
You have 1 minute left.
Not be transparent, to actually be transparent and not impact the photovoltaic aspect. So we are also working on that. And then also these initial tests were run under very dry conditions. And even in summer Phoenix, there is some humidity, which will help with the conversion. We will have OH radical generation and so on. And so all these systematic tests are going on right now. As for a few days now, the lab is back in operation, of course, under safe conditions of social distancing and so on. Also recently, there were some articles that showed the possibility that NOx, through actually a reductive catalyst, transforming NOx into N2 and O2, so not an oxidation but a reduction, that could work. And so we also plan on getting some of those catalysts to test. And with all of this as a summary, so we completed the experimental setup, and that one was tested. We have good preliminary results, but right now we see a lot of conversion of NO to NO2, but we see very little conversion into nitrate, and that's what we are testing right now. And we hope now over summer, really intensively working on this to complete all this proof of concept work by this fall. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you for that presentation. I know we had a couple of questions in the chat, but I think we're going to move on and finish up with the last presentation, and then we can get back to those. So the final presentation today will be on Playspace Redesign to improve children's environment and health, and this is a pilot project in South Phoenix.
All right. Can everyone see my screen? Maybe not.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so you can see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Thanks, everyone. Happy to kind of wrap up these presentations. I'm just going to give an overview of a Re-naturalization project that's ongoing at a Title I charter school in South Phoenix. This idea began quite some time ago, and a collaboration and now a MOU with Paideia Academies has become really strong, and I think what you'll notice throughout this presentation is that it's led to a lot of new opportunities and new studies and some new findings, which is exciting. So I just want to highlight that Brian Windsor is the director at Paideia Academies, and I would call him a PI on this project because of how much he's done and how open and willing he is to collaborate and do important research and be able to use his charter school as a place to derive evidence, not just about the environmental impacts, but about those impacts on the children's health. And I hope I can make that pretty apparent in this talk. And then I have to highlight, because of, I think, this seed funding and other funding from the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience really catalyzed a lot of collaborations with ASU researchers, ASU students, and then of course, the Paideia teachers and students that we've been working with. So I'll start with the problems, because that's what Lisa asked me to start with. I think when we go into this project, you'll see we're really focused on minimizing overexposures to certain atmospheric attributes that Hugh is interested in, so heat and air pollution. But we, of course, like Ari said, we can't leave out radiation. So with respect to outdoor spaces that kids spend a lot of time playing in, we know a lot about UV exposure and sunburns and how that can be dangerous to children's health, and that can lead back to melanoma later on in life. We know that a lot of playgrounds lack shade, especially the way they're designed nowadays, and that there's a lot of negative consequences to overexposure to sun, and that can lead to cognition problems in the classroom. And a very recent study a couple weeks ago just came out showing that, and how radiation alone can result in poor learning and cognition. Higher surface temperatures, just thinking about a child burning their hand on asphalt, slide, rubber, different surfaces that are commonly found in playgrounds is important to understand, and how can we minimize those effects, such as using the right shade in the right place, like Ari was showing with one of her locations in a playground. We know hyperthermia and heat illness are important aspects of children's overall health, and we don't want that to be affecting their behavior, their learning, missed classes and whatnot. So that's a big component of this too. And then air pollution. So I think I mentioned, so this school is sited in South Phoenix, which has historically had higher levels of air pollution. And the school is right along Baseline Road, which has pretty heavy traffic. And so we're also interested in understanding how can we use designs to mitigate air pollution in the play spaces that these 800 students are playing in, and also reduce asthma concerns, because asthma is a really big problem there. So I state all these problems, but I think it's important to remember that the illness or the effects of these exposures are completely avoidable if we can use the right adaptation or mitigation techniques and really think about what are these places being put here for, and that's, we want kids to be able to play safely and learn safely in outdoor environments. That's the goal. And so when we think about why is this needed, we need to be able to support that through design rather than hinder it. And so, like I said, we really take this to the next level by looking at the health impacts to the students as well, but it's a very long-term project. So I don't have too many results to show yet, but overall our big research goal is to assess the impacts of a natural play and learning environment on child health and well-being. And that hasn't even been installed yet, which you'll see, but we're working on our pre-measurements. So we're looking at currently the difference, the current exposures to extreme heat radiation and air pollution in these spaces, and then we'll be able to look at them afterwards as well, examining the children's physical activity through the year, and also trying to see if any changes in the amount of heat illness or asthma incidences occur. And then we're trying to bring nature, green infrastructure, and just nature exposure into children's education and play. And in the recent months, it's been really brought up that these spaces are even more vital with COVID. And a couple of the other PIs on the project and I are meeting with the director, Dr. Windsor, to talk about how we can make sure these spaces are going to be able to be used as outdoor classrooms to avoid overcrowding indoors with COVID. And so we're really trying to highlight the importance of creating these outdoor spaces for the kids. We're doing this in a few ways. So first I'll start with the various types of monitoring we're doing. We have a total of 12 sensors up across, or I guess 13 sensors up across the 2 campuses. We have 6 air quality sensors. These are the air quality sensors that Matt was just talking about, the clarity sensors. And from these, we're interested in NO2 exposures and particulate matter exposures 2.5. And like Matt mentioned, we're interested in comparing the differences between these sensors on the site. So comparing with within the play spaces, or between the play spaces, between the parking lots and the play spaces, and then we can look at the gradients or differences rather than the absolute mass concentration. And what we hope to see is that when we put in more vegetated barriers and trees, so vegetated barriers being hedges, to help mitigate pollution exposure within the play space at the child's height,
1 minute left,
that we start seeing reductions in their exposures. Similarly, we're doing microclimate observations with 6 sensors of temperature, radiation, humidity, and then we have a roof sensor. And so we've also been doing physical activity and radiation exposure monitoring on the kids, but that has to be put on hold right now due to COVID. And then we can get all this really cool, important information. This is from our Roof Davis weather station to look at how we can use wind direction and UV exposure and radiation in the design approach. So we've gone through a few iterations of design. We're now working with Norris Design, and we have a student who is in Dr. Chingwen's Qingwen Cheng's design studio, who's helping us with the plant selection and working with Norris Design to make sure that we're using age-appropriate plants, we're putting trees in the right place. And we will be going out there on Friday to do some pre-measurements of the environment as it is now in both play spaces with Ariana's Marty carts. And then another important part was we asked students, teachers, parents what they want to see. We had the kids tell us, we had them design what they would want to see and incorporated that into the play space. I'm going to go quickly through this slide. I just have to mention that we are working with this school nurse to try and address what's happening between the exposure and in the school, because we really need to understand that missing link before they go to the emergency department or before they end up on their way home. What are the symptoms? Are they missing class? Are they getting sick at school? And we know this is happening, but there's not a very good database for it. And I will say Katrina Gerster is our student on that. So we are breaking ground hopefully this summer on the first play space and organizing some fundraising events. As I said, we're adapting with COVID. We're working on mapping our connections and collaborations and all the new pathways there, which has been fun to do. Adora is doing, piloting her HeatReady School project with Paideia, and we're also figuring out how to be part of the Social Embeddedness Collaboratory. A lot of this was funded by other grants too, so we've been able to leverage the HUE funds already to get a Green STEAM grant from HIDA, ASU, Paideia, and I applied to a Farm to School grant. We're able to build these Lear gardens that I'm showing you here, which is really neat, and I met Ed, who runs the Lear Gardens through the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience, who's a past funder. Qingwen Cheng got an EPA Rainworks Award, and then we were just successful in getting a Bright Futures Mayor Innovation Project Award with the City of Phoenix to help pay for a lot of the trees and other vegetation going into these play spaces. So that time went by fast, but thank you for listening.
Okay, thanks so much for all the presenters. I do have to disclose that I'm having a notification that my internet connection is unstable. So if I disappear for a few seconds, I apologize. I will try to work on my phone then. So we've had a couple of clarifying questions that were in the chat. So I would like to just direct these to different people along the way. Pierre, there was a question from Mark Hartman about the benefits of doing this coding on photovoltaic cells. Would that just be better to just paint roofs? Have you done any sort of comparisons between these two options?
Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent question. We haven't done any comparison yet. I mean, we're still, we're relatively early on. The big thing for the paint is it doesn't really work. So there are more and more studies that there are a lot of issues with the paints. Part of the issue of the paint is that it comes with many other things in the paint that limit access to the photocatalysts. And so actually I didn't explain this well, but one way that at the end we would hope to get a photocatalyst on a solar panel is that you can embed it straight into glass without any binder, without anything. Another issue of the paints is that people realized that the paint worked really well for a day or two, but they soiled extremely rapidly. And so again, there is hope that on the photo cells, the photovoltaics, there's less of that. And photovoltaics also typically getting cleaned at certain intervals, because otherwise if you get too much dust deposition or so on the photovoltaics, it also decreases the electrical yield of these photovoltaics. So there are some things that make us hopeful that it would make sense to put onto photovoltaics more than just putting white paint everywhere.
Okay, great, thank you. This question is for Ariane, and I think it's a math question, and I believe Mark Hartman asked this question. There was a 30-degree difference, and so if you're starting at 100 degrees MRT, would that be 190 degrees in the sun? I
we
probably
just
totally messed up that chat question.
we just resolved it because in order to convert between Fahrenheit and Celsius, you have to subtract 32 degrees. And so it's not quite 90 degrees, it's more like 54 degrees. Yeah, I think we resolved that. Mark,
Okay.
do you think?
Okay, great. And Dave Handula, there was a question about the HeatReady framework. Is that for all cities or is that just for desert cities?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for that. There's nothing in the process right now that would inherently couple it to desert cities. And we've had conversations with folks at the National Integrated Heat Health Information System to ensure that we have some applicability outside of this region. We're starting this region because we love this region and want to focus on it. But yes, plans to expand nationally and perhaps even internationally, although we've been a little weaker there in thinking about other country contexts.
Okay, and thank you. And Jenny, there was a question about community involvement, and this is going to be part of the next question that I'm going to ask the greater group, but community involvement in your project, and how will this renaturalization benefit the community? And you can define community however you want.
Yeah, so I think we have two communities. We have the school community directly at Paideia with the teachers and students, and then we have the community of more involving the surrounding community of South Phoenix and then the parents. And I think we can see the direct connections at Paideia, and we're already starting to see that through changes in their curriculum to incorporate a lot of these outdoor spaces in their learning, which is exciting. I didn't really get to talk too much about the food, and that wasn't necessarily a part of my HUE proposal, but in renaturalizing a space and wanting to make sure that the kids, and 85% of these kids are on the free and reduced lunch program, they're learning how to grow their own food. And I'm not the lead on that, but it's very exciting to me that we're working in an area that is considered a food desert, that is low income, and we're incorporating some really neat lessons in their education, but they'll also be able to have ways to have a fruit stand eventually, or a vegetable stand, and take that home. And they already actually do that with the eggs from the chicken, so they're not starting from scratch. So that's very exciting. So that's the school community. And outside, part of the process as we renaturalize the outdoor spaces to do a community tree planting. And we have talked to the Nature Conservancy about that, so that the families can come in, be part of the tree planting, learn what they're planting, where and why. And who knows, maybe we can figure out a way that they can take a tree home with them too. But I think that there's learning there, but then there's also this benefit to furthering the city of Phoenix and their goal to have higher canopy cover and higher vegetation cover and reduce pollution and reduce heat. So I think that's important as well. And then, as I said, we had parents already involved, and the teachers and students involved in helping us shape what these outdoor spaces will look like and what they want there. So I think that because we've had this involvement the whole way, it's been a different type of project. It's been slower, but I think it's going to be more impactful in the end.
Yes, community engagement does seem to slow things down. And when you were engaging with the community, did you have experts as part of this brainstorming? And how did you, because I think this is something that a lot of researchers struggle with, that you want to get community input, and yet you, in whatever your specialty field is, know that that's really unreasonable. So how did you handle that tension when they were talking about designing a play space?
So I don't think Chingwen's on this call, but so with her and then Paul Caseo, we embedded this project as one of the design studio projects. And so they had 3 workshops as part of her class that they brought to Paideia, and they held in their cafenesium. And I showed a couple pictures from that. And that helped especially design the terrace campus, which is where most of the students are playing. But it was a bit less formal, I guess you could say. And it wasn't a full focus group. It was whoever wanted to kind of show up and tell us about what they like about their current play space and what they want to see more of. And it was really fun to hear also from the parents. There was a lot of asking for more space, which is tough in this. You can't really get more space, but we can try and make the space at least more usable throughout a greater proportion of the day, which I think is exciting. When we worked with the children, it was a little bit different. We had part of our project to have them do photo stories and artistic renderings. And we did have, you could say, people who had very good qualitative research experience to do that. So I wasn't leading that portion. Erin Hess, who's a professor on the downtown campus, and Brian Grant, who's a school of sustainability PhD student, helped run those kind of focus groups, but then one-on-one interactions with kindergartners, which was so interesting to us and fun. And Adora is helping with this too, working on a paper to publish that. But I showed some of the artistic renderings that the kids could explain to us why they put certain things in their playground. So it just depended on which community member we're thinking about and talking with. With the teachers, they filled out forms that one of the designers sent them. Like, what do you want to see? They wanted amphitheaters, they wanted shade, they wanted benches, they wanted spaces that they could go use the space because they never go out in the playground, but they want to. So that was interesting as well. So I think we've learned a lot from the different community types along the way.
Excellent. So building off of that, the HUE project is to really come up with solutions and that can be used by the community, however you're defining the community. And for the people who presented today, if you could just spend a minute or two talking about how you're going to have your data be presented to the community, or whether you've worked with the community. I know that, like Matt, your community are business people and other people are dealing with residents. So how are you going to get that information out to them? So like Ariane, you have a whole bunch of really great data about different kinds of shading that would be really great. And Dave Saylor, you have all this information about what could be. How are you going to get this information out?
Yeah, well, there is a pre-COVID and post-COVID answer to that, I guess. So the pre-COVID answer would have been, we wanted to conduct workshops with the city of Tempe, and we've done some workshops through a differently funded project, the Pew project, which Paul Caseo has been leading, and Jenny and Dave are part of this too. It's a larger group of people, and we've been meeting with city staff over the course of the past year to work on the design of multi-use path and parks and thermal exposure in these places. And the shade information would be an additional information on top of all of this. The post-COVID answer is a little bit unclear. So with earlier during this call, that once we have put all the results into a shape that's digestible, not only a publication, but also digestible by city staff. We will probably do a virtual workshop and try to arrange Zoom meetings with city staff from different departments, from parks, from urban forestry, Richard Atkins, to bring them in and show them the results, and then solicit their feedback, because they have probably a completely different perspective on our findings as well. If we say, oh, ficus trees are the best ones for shade, according to our ranking, and then they say, well, but they use a lot of water. So there are many more aspects that need to go into the final recommendation. Yeah, so I think the current status or the current plan would be to do a virtual Zoom meeting with city staff once the results are finalized. And then hopefully in the future, add more information as the water use of the trees, air quality aspects would be very interesting as well to look at the trade-off between some of the trees that we might recommend for shade may have high VOC levels. In that case, maybe a shade structure might be better. So bringing in more of those trade-offs into those results to come up with a more holistic recommendation would be important.
Excellent. Does anyone else? Dave Saylor, do you want to weigh in? Anyone else?
Sure. So yeah, with our project, as I mentioned, and as you're well aware, it's a multi-pronged collaboration among ASU researchers and City of Phoenix and the neighborhood. So there have been a lot of design charrettes and community engagement that have helped get us where we are today. And so my hope would be going forward that we would remain part of that conversation and convey some of our results both to the city housing department, but also to the community, especially once the redesign happens and the neighborhood is built out. I think the challenge is that we are not really doing a controlled experiment where we're changing one thing. So we're trying to model the design that the city eventually settled on, which has a lot of moving parts, some of which are not good for thermal, the thermal comfort of the neighborhood. So like the photovoltaic on buildings actually adds some heat to the air as it flows over the rooftops, which mixes into the neighborhood. And so we would want going forward to be able to, first of all, be able to convince ourselves and then city officials and planners that the model is able to to quantify what the actual outcomes of these design changes are. But then we would want to take it the next step and actually start doing more controlled experiments where we look at just changing one thing at a time, just the linear park, or just the higher buildings, or just the shade structures of the photovoltaics. And I think by doing a more detailed study like that, we'll be able to provide much more substantial guidance directly to the planners. So it wouldn't be for this neighborhood, it'd be for future development efforts and for other cities as well.
Excellent. Does anybody else want to weigh in on how you're going to communicate this to your community?
No, I mean, I mentioned corporate engagement, but I definitely think that when you look at the inventory of vacant lots for dust mitigation, there's a great opportunity to work with communities that are greatly impacted. And we look forward to, once we have more conclusive data, to start to engage in some of those communities.
Okay, so I think that Chuck opened up this meeting talking about some of the really large events that are happening, and one being COVID, and certainly Arizona seems to be in the thick of it right now. The whole social justice, inequity, Black Lives Matter movement is another, and the economic downturn is certainly concerning, especially since how Arizona had limped through, shall we say, the 2008 economic downturn. So I'm just wondering if you could all make a comment on how your projects are either addressing inequities, have been able to shift a little bit for COVID, and whether or not an economic downturn would impact you and how you might be helpful in any of those things. So, I mean, Dave Hondo, I'm going to put you on the spot to start off with. How has your work with the HeatReady system been impacted by any of those, and are you shifting your focus because of either COVID, Black Lives Matter, or the economic downturn?
Yeah, good question, Melissa. Thank you for that. I'll say in the application as it exists right now, there is already an implicit equity question that asks what communities understand about the impacts of heat and why they're important to address. And we're going to be very keen to read those responses and see what the current perception is. We are debating adding a COVID specific question, so in general, how is this confluence events that you're describing impacting heat management in the city? But that would be more for our curiosity and perhaps less relevant to our actual objective. But I've seen in some other projects we've been starting to add that question in, and it's producing interesting results. We've asked Mark and Braden and some of the other advisors about the feasibility of completing this application during COVID, and thus far, while it might go a little slower than we had originally thought, nobody sees it being prohibitively difficult. That might be different in a smaller jurisdiction like Yuma, which we'll find out about soon.
Okay, great, thanks. Anyone else care to address how this could?
Well, sorry, Melissa, if I could just also add that, I mean, you're part of these conversations as well. Melissa and Hugh and Kerr have helped stand up a weekly heat coordination call. And I think one of the really interesting dynamics that we're seeing is that sometimes some of the people who we normally expect to be key voices in that conversation are pulled away or fatigued, or they're just kind of over everything right now. And I think we're seeing other voices emerge in the conversation to fill some of those gaps. Braden pointed this out really early on in the stage, that the traditional actors have to think an hour and a day ahead, and now non-traditional actors have to jump in to think a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks ahead.
Good point. Good point. Anybody else from the group?
This is Chuck. I'm not from the group. My dream is that the work that we're actually doing in terms of social justice and economic downturn will actually improve the situation. That is, the answer I want to hear from Dave Handula is HeatReady will have characteristics that say changes we make will improve the lives of people that need the most improving, rather than green infrastructure that in fact often ends up in the well-to-do neighborhoods just because of willingness and agitation and things like that. So, I mean, what I would like to believe going forward with you is that we actually will seriously think how our actions that weren't originally designed to improve social justice could be redesigned or redeployed in ways, or at least to ensure these kind of outcomes.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that too, that I would say, like, this isn't how it works, and you don't get points for things, but if you get 10 points for putting a solution in a vulnerable neighborhood and 1 point for a wealthy neighborhood because they're needed most there, then you're more heat ready because that's where the impacts will be felt. So it should be weighted that way. So in other words, by that evaluation should give priority and emphasis to communities impacted by heat the most. So yeah, I think it can do that. We can engineer that. And I guess that's for further discussion, Dave, but I thought I should weigh in on that too.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Absolutely. And I'll just note, Chuck, that the conversation, sorry, I didn't communicate as such in the presentation, but I suspect every other conversation we've had about building out the rubric and framework has mentioned equity in one form or another, whether it's a separate category or whether equity is, there's quote, scoring for equity in every other category. This has been really a central part of the conversation. Mark has been a champion of that cause as much as anyone.
So I'm happy to jump in on this one because I think that it's on my mind a lot with this project, and as part, the Paideia community and the community they serve is 67% Hispanic or Latino and 20% Black African-American students. And I think that if we can do anything to provide them healthier, safer spaces and improve their educational outcomes, starting from preschool there, all the way up to grade 8, I think that says a lot. And what I want to try to do is a better job at quantifying that along the way. I'm not sure how yet, but I think there's an opportunity to be able to work with the school and make sure that we can state what are the impacts to these child lives long term. And the director has expressed to me he wants to do longitudinal studies. It's just figuring out where can we get the funding for that. And the other really important piece that I think really came out as part of the Kerr project, and I'm looking at Patricia right now, we went and visited Paideia and we asked, what is resilience to you or you? And what resilience was to the director of Paideia was a lot more about how those students are able to respond, and just with just the smallest interpersonal or personal conflict versus what we might think as a city's resilience. And it was really eye-opening to me that these different changes that we can make in their school environment can have a huge impact on them and how they're able to be resilient themselves, which I think is important, and the school sees that, and that's how their framework works to educate the whole child, which is really important if we think about holistic sustainability and how we're making these changes throughout the city, that they all have potential co-benefits with each other. And of course, there's some unintended ones we need to think about too, but I'm trying to figure out a way to better quantify this and then also map out what we did to work with the school so that other schools can see this is how we fundraise. This is where we got money. This is how we worked with the school. This is how we developed an MOU so that other places can do the same thing, that feel like, you know, oh, we don't have resources from the district, so we can't put in shade. There's no place for that. And I think that there's a way to also figure out how we can message better from this project. So
thank you to everyone. We have 2 more minutes left, and I know one of the questions we really wanted to get to was a discussion about gaps in the HUE portfolio that were not necessarily 15 separate pilot projects, but really developing a comprehensive approach to improving heat and air quality in this region. And it would be really great if you could email or put in the chat box any of your ideas, or contact any one of the HUE team to help us with this, because then that will help us moving forward in what we're going to do next. And with that, I want to thank everyone, but Matt is going to do the formal thank you and close out the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you all for your participation, for your insights, for being on another Zoom call with a whole lot of people. We really do appreciate it. Obviously, this is not the ideal format that we wanted to have this convening in, but these are the times that we live in. I do want to mention that, you know, today we summarized the 2019 projects, which had a little bit more results in the way. But next we're going to be convening the next round of HUE grantees, which will take place on July 29th in the afternoon from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. These projects are a little more in their formation stage, maybe not as much results oriented, but we do have the opportunity to have this similar discussion about building a portfolio, promoting active engagement with the communities that are most directly impacted by heat and air quality, and how you do that in the world that we live in today. So with that, I would like to thank you. I'd also like to know that there are a number of our 2020 grantees on the line. We will be doing a pre-survey before that July 29th meeting, just to get some insight from you to help guide some of the structured conversations going forward. So with that, on behalf of myself, Chuck, Lisa, everybody with the HUE team, I want to thank everybody for calling in this morning, and thank you for your continued support and your continued engagement. Most important is the engagement. We really do appreciate everything you have to say. So with that, thanks everybody.
thanks. Bye everyone. Oh, hey Aaron.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.